Welcome everybody to the 33rd Annual California Small Farm Conference. We're about halfway through the conference, and if you are here for the seed production workshop, you are in the right place. Thanks so much for being here, and big thanks to Jared here for giving this presentation. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. We put on this organization, have been supporting and serving and representing family farms across California for over 4 decades. If you want to learn more about our organization, check us out at caff.org. We'll post more information in the chat. Wanted to give a big shout out as well to all of our sponsors this year who made the event possible. Not only possible, but also free. So if you really appreciate this free service and the education that you were able to access this week, consider making a donation. We'll be posting that link there in the chat. And a huge shout out to all of our sponsors who really did make this event possible. You can learn more about our sponsors and even meet some of those exhibiting at our expo hall, which will also be right there in the chat. So when you finish up this workshop, swing on by the expo hall and say hello. We wish we could be with you in person, but this year we're going virtual. But really appreciate y'all being here. If you have questions throughout today's workshop, you can post them. If you look at the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. So just click that, post a question, and when we finish the presentation, we'll move on to Q&A and we'll get some of those questions answered. In the meantime, we encourage you all to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and to share resources, tips. This is all participatory. The collective knowledge of the whole is greater than one, so please participate. Really appreciate you guys being here. And without much more further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jared. Jared, thanks so much for being with us, and he's here to tell us about seeds. So let's get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Evan. And I am thrilled to be here and really happy to be able to share a little bit about how to grow seeds with you all today. And let me start by introducing myself. My name is Jared Zystro. I work for Organic Seed Alliance. Organic Seed Alliance, we're a nonprofit that has, we have staff in California, Washington, Montana, Wisconsin, throughout the country, working regionally and nationally to train farmers, to save seeds, to breed new varieties. We also work to build stronger seed networks and advocate for policies that strengthen and protect seed communities. So we work in a lot of different areas focused around trying to get good seed in the hands of the people that grow it and can steward it. I want to start just by giving a little bit of perspective around the idea of where seed comes from and why seed saving and seed growing can be so important. Often, if you're thinking about seed, whether you're a farmer or a gardener, you're thinking that seed, you know it doesn't just necessarily magically arrive at your farm or garden unless you saved it yourself, but you think that seed, it took a path. Your contact with that seed maybe is just from a retail seed company, whether that's a local sales representative that you work with, or if you go through a catalog or a website and you buy the seed. But they are usually not the people who are actually responsible for growing that seed. They often buy that seed in turn from what's called a breeder or producer company. So these are large companies that work around the globe and actually are responsible for the development of new varieties and for the production of that seed. And that doesn't even stop there. They usually don't grow their own seed either. They usually contract with a seed producer or seed production company. And this could be anywhere in the world. So your local food that you're growing might be coming from a large multinational company, and that seed might be being grown in India, in China, anywhere around the world with very different priorities than you might have for your own farming or gardening. And what we see with this globalized system is we see an extreme amount of concentration. Almost all seed is grown and sold by a small handful of companies, including Bayer, Corteva, Bass, ChemChina. And interestingly enough, all of these companies also have strong pesticide and chemical arms. And so if you think about what those companies and what their priorities are, they're not necessarily going to be aligned with yours if you're trying to grow organically or low input or under sustainable agriculture. They're often looking for seeds that they can grow one variety, produce one variety that they can sell all around the world and is grown and or is bred and developed in such a way that that variety can be sold as a package with their inputs that they sell in their company. So what you can see is that this is often not a situation that's in alignment with low input and organic farming and leaves farmers in the lurch. And what we also are seeing right now is that there's a huge need for seed. If you looked at, I just pulled all these headlines off the web today, and these are all headlines just from the last few weeks of this massive demand for seed and seed shortages that's precipitated in part by COVID and this renaissance in gardening. But that's not the only reason there's a big demand for seed and for seed producers. If we're talking about organic seed in particular, on the farming and commercial side of things, organic food has been growing 10% or more every year for the last 20 years. And those organic producers, they cannot find enough organic seed to meet their needs. They're still typically getting around 50% of their seed from non-organic or conventional sources. And they would like to be finding seed that was adapted to their system, but there's just not enough variety and not enough quantity of seed that's currently available organically and developed for organic farmers out there. And then on the home gardener side of things, those headlines demonstrate there's this huge demand for seed from gardeners. And if you look at 2020 sales figures, seed companies had massive increases in sales in 2020, often spending down or selling almost all of their seed inventory, which they typically keep 2 to 3 years of inventory on hand. And that trend is continuing in 2021. All of this equals out to there's a shortage of seed right now, and there's a large demand if you're thinking about being in commercial seed production for becoming a commercial seed producer. It also means that if you're considering your own needs as a gardener or as a farmer, right now is a time that you might be wanting to consider securing your own personal seed sources by growing seed for yourself so that you don't end up in a situation where you're looking through the catalogs or calling the seed companies and they say, sorry, we're all out of stock of these varieties that you need right now, or we can't fulfill your order for another 8 weeks. If you grow the seed yourself, you'll have a much more reliable supply. One of the great situations that is arising in response to this demand and in response to the troubling trend of these large global corporations owning and controlling so much of the seed system is we are seeing a renaissance in regional ethical seed stewards that are selling and stewarding varieties for their communities, for their regions. A couple of California examples include Kristen Leach at Namu Farms in Winters, who has been stewarding Korean heritage varieties of vegetables and selling them and helping maintain these rare and important crops. Likewise, Rowan White up in Sierra City with Sierra Seeds and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network has been stewarding seeds and training other indigenous communities in how to steward their own seeds, protect varieties that have been maintained, improved, and stewarded for generations by indigenous communities in this country and around the world. And this is really some promising trends. So you can see there's an opportunity here, there's a need here, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time with you just giving you a quick rundown of terminology so that you can get kind of your feet under you in terms of understanding what people are talking about and how different varieties and different crops perform differently when you're trying to grow them for seed. And I'm going to give you a brief walkthrough of what a season of growing seed might look like. I want to start off by saying, though, every crop is different. And when you get into seed growing, you'll realize that those crops are different when you grow them for seed than when you grow them for vegetables. And that each one has its own quirks, its own tips and tricks that you're going to need to learn. And I'm not, unfortunately, in the 35 minutes or so that I have with you still, I'm not going to be able to walk you through every single one of those crops, but I am going to be able to point you to some resources that you can use to continue to learn and expand your knowledge. And I'm going to give you this baseline foundation. So I want to start by breaking down one of the basic categories that us seed savers like to talk when we talk about different ways that seed crops differ. And this is how the flowers are arranged on the plants. And this is going to be relevant, you'll see, for how the plants are able to reproduce, and in turn, how you need to manage them when you're growing them for seed. So the first kind of flower is what we call perfect flowers. These are flowers that have both the pollen bearing and seed bearing parts on the same flower. So in order to make seed, what has to happen is that pollen has to travel from, these are called the anthers here, the pollen bearing parts, and then that pollen has to travel and land here on the stigma of the female part and grow down into what are known as the ovaries of the flower, and then they connect up and fertilize and make seeds. In the case of self-pollinated flowers like these, it's a very short trip, and often, as you might guess, actually, I gave it away here. These perfect flowers are often found in plants that are capable of pollinating themselves, and they're known as self-pollinating plants. And we'll get into that a few slides later. Many of the crops that you know are self-pollinating or have perfect flowers. These include tomatoes, beans, peas, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, sunflowers, lettuce. So these are all perfect flowers. Not all of these actually are self-pollinating, and I'll explain why that's the case in a little bit. But they all do have these perfect flowers that have both pollen and seed-bearing parts on each flower. The next way that we divide things out is monoecious plants that have flowers that are either just have the seed bearing parts or have the pollen bearing parts. So this flower here on the squash plant only produces pollen, and this squash here only is going to be making seed. So in order to be able to produce seed, the pollen has to travel from this flower over here and pollinate and fertilize the seed-bearing flower in order to make seed. Examples include corn, squash, cucumber, melon, watermelon. So what you can tell right away is that in order to make seed, something has to happen to get that pollen from here to here. And in the case of squash, we're typically talking about insects, but it may be insects, it may be wind. Those are kind of the two main ways that plants that have these separate monoecious flowers are able to pollinate and make seed. And then the third sort of most extreme example of separating out the pollen and seed-bearing flowers is what we call dioecious plants, where now you have an entire plant where all of the flowers on that plant are all pollen-bearing, or all the flowers on that plant are all seed-bearing. Examples of this include spinach, asparagus, ginkgo, hemp. There's many fruit trees that are like this, where you'll have either a pollen-bearing tree or a seed-bearing tree. And in this case, you know that you actually, in order to make seed, if you only have a seed-bearing plant or seed-bearing plants, it won't have anywhere to get pollen and it won't make seed. Likewise, if you only have a pollen-bearing plant or pollen-bearing plants, it won't have a way to make seed. I will say that typically with these dioecious plants, they will form what we call hermaphroditic plants if they get stressed out and they're not able to access any pollen bearing or any seed bearing plants in the field. So you'll often see this reversion, so that a few seeds will still form even in the case of all pollen or all seed bearing plants. The other way that we divide things is talking about the life cycle of the plant. And the two biggest categories that we typically divide seed crops into are annuals and biennials. We also do have many perennial plants, but they typically are less of, uh, when we're talking about food crops, at least, they are a little less common when we're talking about seed growing food crops. Annual plants are ones where they go from seed all the way through their reproductive cycle and through their vegetative growth, and then through the reproductive cycle where they'll bolt, flower, pollinate, and set seed all in 1 year. That year, however, that season has to be long enough. So some things that might theoretically be annuals may not really have a long enough season if, for example, you lived in Alaska or something like that. Annual plants are very, very common in a lot of our crop plants because, in essence, we've selected plants that have really rapid life cycles for growing for food. Biennial plants are ones that take 2 years to make seed, and typically what you see is that in their first year, they grow from seed and produce some kind of vegetative storage, whether this is a bulb in the case of something like onions, if it might be fleshy leaves on chard or cabbage, might be a storage root in something like carrots or parsnips, but some way they basically produce some vegetative storage material that will allow them to go through the winter. And then the following season, they transition from vegetative growth to reproductive growth, will send up a flower stalk, make flowers, pollinate, and set seed in that second season. Typically, what you have to have for a biennial to set seed is vernalization, or some degree of cold temperatures over the winter time, so that the plant knows that it's gone through winter, and then when the temperatures warm up again, it's now in its second year and it's ready to reproduce. Those vernalization or cold requirements vary from crop to crop and even from variety to variety within crops. But typically we're looking at somewhere around 8 weeks of weather that's below 50 degrees in order for most biennial plants to know that they've gone through the winter, and then when it warms up again, they'll make seed. The final way that I'm going to talk about how we divide seed crops is the difference between whether they're self-pollinating or cross-pollinating. Self-pollinating, also known as inbreeding or inbreeders or selfers, these are plants that will make seed where they receive the pollen from each individual flower, will receive its own pollen, and that will then allow it to make seed. So in order to do that, they have to have perfect flowers. Remember what those are. They have both the pollen and seed-bearing parts in each flower. That would be necessary for them to self-pollinate. The stigma, meaning the male pollen-bearing parts, the anthers, the male pollen-bearing parts, the stigma, the female pollen-receiving parts, have to be close together. They tend to produce relatively few seeds per plant, but produce large seeds. Cross-pollinating plants, on the other hand, these are now plants that, in general, need to get pollen from another plant in order to make seed, or they will prefer or will have different mechanisms that encourage crossing between different plants in the same field. These might have perfect flowers, or they may have monoecious or dioecious flowers. Often, if you kind of look at a cross-pollinating plant, you'll notice that the stigma and the anthers are far apart. So the male and female, or the pollen-bearing and the seed-bearing parts are far apart. And this physical separation is to encourage crossing. Often there's lots and lots and lots of pollen being made because this pollen has to go really far. And because of that, it needs more pollen to ensure that some of that pollen ultimately lands on another plant and can make seed. They'll often have lots of flowers to attract pollinators and lots of small seeds, and have those flowers be showy, meaning they've got big attractive petals so that insects know where to find them. Wind pollinated flowers rather than insect pollinated flowers, don't need to have showy flowers in order to cross. They typically will have their flowers somewhere up high on the plant where the wind can blow them. So corn is an example of this, where the tassels of the corn are actually the pollen-bearing flowers. And when the tassels get blown around and shook in the wind, that pollen is released and can blow and land on the silks, or the female uh, the pollen receiving parts of the corn. Here's kind of a close-up where you can see some examples of how self-pollinating plants and cross-pollinating flowers look different. So here, looking at this pea plant, this is a self-pollinating flower, and see how it's all really closed up tightly? It's closed up tightly to discourage cross-pollination. All of the reproductive structures of this flower are tucked inside of these petals, where they can't be easily accessed by insects. On the other hand, this Phacelia is really just all out there, trying to attract pollinators to spread that pollen far and wide. Not all crops are cut and dry in terms of whether they're self or cross-pollinated. And some, you'll find different varieties have different structures that will lead them to be more cross or self-pollinated. An example here of tomatoes, some tomatoes, typically more heirloom types, will have what we call an exerted stigma, where you can see here the stigma, the pollen receiving part, is sticking up above this anther cone, above the male parts. And this is so that it can cross more. In more modern types, that stigma is tucked underneath and will tend to self-pollinate. Okay, why does this matter? One of the things, there are three things actually I really want you to get out of this talk that I'm giving today. The first is the idea that when you're seed saving, you actually are a plant breeder. Whether you intend to or not, the choices that you make and the seeds that you save can improve that variety or make that variety less improved. And so thoughtful care about both how you steward that variety, how many plants you grow, how you protect it from unwanted pollen, and which plants you ultimately save seed from can improve that variety for your farm year to year. The other two concepts that I want to talk to you about, I'm going to talk to you about right now, and they're kind of in reference to the self and cross-pollinated chart that I'm showing you here, because cross-pollinating versus self-pollinating plants exist at different sides of the spectrum, and that's going to be relevant for these two concepts I want to introduce. So first off, understand that when I talk about self-pollinating and cross-pollinating, it's really easy to be cut and dry and say, this is a self-pollinated crop, this is a cross-pollinated crop. That's not really the case. There really is a spectrum of things that are more or less cross-pollinating. Crops that are more self-pollinating, more closer to this selfer side of the spectrum, have different requirements for population size and for isolation distance. So these two terms are really important, and I want to walk you through them. Population size is how many plants do you need to save seed from in order to maintain a healthy, vigorous variety year after year after year. Isolation distance is how far does my seed crop need to be away from any other flowering varieties of that same species, so that I don't accidentally have them crossing and mixing up varieties. In the case of self-pollinated crops, they tend to require relatively small population sizes, so you can save seed from relatively few plants, and they also don't require much isolation distance because they tend to be pollinating themselves and discouraging pollination from the surrounding area. On the other hand, if we move to this side of this spectrum, to the cross-pollinated side, things like corn and brassica family members, they cross a lot, and because of that, they actually really need crossing to maintain a healthy, vigorous variety year after year after year. And so they need large populations of plants to cross with each other. And They also require much greater isolation distances between them and another flowering variety of that same species. So something when I'm saying this about isolation distance, keep in mind I keep saying flowering variety of the same species. So as a seed grower, you're going to need to learn your species names because it's going to matter. For example, with Cucurbita pepo, that same species has pumpkins, zucchini, delicatas, ornamental gourds. And you could say, oh, these are all very different crops. Summer squash, winter squash, gourds. I can grow them all. That's fine. They're actually all Cucurbita pepo, and they will all cross with each other. On the other hand, there's other kinds of squash that won't cross with Cucurbita pepo. There's Maxima squash and Moschata squash that you can grow side by side, and they won't cross together because they're different species. So how do you manage these isolation distances? It can be a real challenge, whether you're a gardener or a farmer. First is just planning your garden or farm in a way where you're growing different species, especially when we're talking about those cross-pollinated types. Talking to your neighbors, understanding what they want to grow, and figure out how to grow in a way that the seed crops that you care about aren't things that they're going to be growing. Or provide them with seed of the varieties that you're already going to be planting. Giving them free seeds is always nice. And then if they grow the same thing you're growing, it won't matter as much if there's a little bit of crossing between them because it's the same variety. Consider prevailing winds and consider if there's any barriers that help prevent cross-pollination. If you are growing crops of other varieties of crop that are the same as one of your seed crops, harvest those and till them in before they can flower, and you can be okay. So if you really are trying to grow spinach for seed, but also lots of different varieties of spinach for market, as long as you harvest that spinach and till in all those plants before they can go to flower, you're okay. And then at least on a garden scale, and even on experimental side, if you're farming, sometimes letting things cross can result in some really interesting and beautiful new varieties that can be adapted to your farm. For example, this zinnia here is an example from the Organic Seed Alliance research farm where lots of different varieties are planted, and they've just been allowed to cross and ended up with some really beautiful, interesting new types of zinnia. So now I've started the first half of the talk where I've given you a lot of terms and given you kind of a baseline of understanding around the nuts and bolts of the different types of seed crops. Now I want to briefly walk you through a season of growing seed crops. So in this case, I'm going to start just talking about, for most of the season, growing seed crops is similar to growing if you're used to growing vegetable crops. There are a lot of the same practices and approaches that you'll be applying here, but there are a few differences. First is in timing. So seed crops take a lot longer to grow typically than the equivalent vegetable crop. So here, using lettuce as an example, this lettuce, if you were growing it for market, would have been done months and months ago, but these are still not fully done with maturing seed. And so you'll have several more months in the ground for lettuce seed crop versus a lettuce crop for market. Some crops actually are about the same in terms of something like tomatoes, winter squash. Those, if you're growing them for seed or if you're growing them for market for a vegetable, it's about the same. Spacing. The amount of space that you need for seed crops often is much larger. Again, looking at this lettuce picture here, you can see compared to when these were just lettuces for market, they've gotten much, much, much bigger. And in turn, they need more space in order to have good airflow between the plants so that we don't have disease problems. So one thing you can consider certainly on a garden level or sometimes even on a farm level is you can grow them at your normal spacing for a vegetable crop. And then as long as you've got to end up with enough plants at the end, you can harvest out, maybe you grew 3 rows on a bed, you can harvest out the middle row and then harvest out every other plant and end up leaving an appropriately spaced amount of plants out that then can go to seed while not having to waste all that extra space in the early growing season. Some of these plants might need staking, where they wouldn't need staking if you're just growing them as a vegetable crop. When you're managing irrigation, you'll have to think a little differently, because for seed crops, once they've started to go to flower and to seed, you really want to avoid overhead irrigation. And so you're going to either want to establish or switch to some kind of drip or furrow irrigation once they're starting to flower, because that overhead irrigation can cause sprouting and it can cause diseases. Fertility management, by and large, is going to be about the same if you're growing this crop for seed or for vegetables, but keep in mind that both fertility and water, you should be planning for it to be an extended season and make sure it has adequate fertility and water all the way through until it's finished maturing seed. When it comes to weed management, again, it comes down to the fact that we're looking at a much longer season here. And so weeds where you may, if you, again, looking at this lettuce crop, been able to not worry about the weeds and just say, I'll be harvesting this quickly and just tilling under the patch before the weeds get out of control. That's not the case with a long season seed crop. You're going to want to continue removing weeds throughout the season, so that way at the end of the year when we get to harvest, there aren't a bunch of weeds all tangled up with your plants. Now, at come late summer and fall, when it's time to harvest the seeds, this is where we start looking at a whole different process than you might be thinking that you might be used to when you're just growing crops for market. I'm going to walk you through that process right now. It's basically harvest, thresh, clean, dry, store. So how do you harvest? This can vary quite a bit, from a hand harvest where you're cutting individual plants, or pulling plants out of the ground, which I actually don't recommend because you'd like to avoid having any dirt mix in with your seeds. You may be able to just bend the plants over once they're close to shattering or releasing the seeds from the pod, bend them over into a bucket and shake the plants so that the seeds shatter into a bucket. You might be hand collecting individual fruits in the case of something like cucumbers or tomatoes. And there's lots of different tools that you might use. And certainly at a larger scale, often you're looking at things like combines and threshing machines and windrowing machines during this harvest process. Once you've harvested the plants, in other words, once you've somehow got the plant out of the field, separated it from the ground, you still usually benefit from some amount of post-harvest drying. This allows the seeds to complete maturity and suck up a little bit more energy from the stems and leaves of the plant. It helps allow the plants to get nice and crispy dry, which is going to help once we get to the next step of threshing. This can basically happen, you can just lay these plants directly on the ground in windrows. You could put them on top of a material to keep them separate from the dirt. If you do that, though, I would highly recommend something that's permeable, like remer, floating row cover, rather than an impermeable thing like a tarp, because tarps can have moisture condensation form in between the bottom of the plant and the tarp. Really, either which way, whether you do a tarp, which I don't recommend, or not, you still want to be flipping these plants occasionally so that the wet side gets exposed to the air and the sun and dries more rapidly. If you need to, because the weather is turning and it's getting about to be rainy and you want to bring them inside, that's often a good idea. You can bring it into a high tunnel or something like that where it's still exposed to some light and some heat. You want to make sure, though, the most important thing is that it gets lots of air going through so that it's drying and not taking a risk of molding. And so thinking about fans, thinking if you're going to put it on something, put it on a screen table where airflow can get underneath the plants as well as on top. Those are things to consider if you're going to bring it inside. Now you've got dry plants with hopefully mature seed. The next step is threshing. Threshing is basically separating the seeds from the stems. This isn't cleaning. This is just breaking those seeds free. This can happen in a lot of different ways, from stomping in a bucket, having all your friends stomp on a tarp, There are threshing machines. Certain seed crops, typically smaller seeds, you actually can just thresh as they're doing here with a truck by driving over them. But larger seeds can be at risk of the seed actually forming small cracks and reducing the vigor and germination of your seeds. So be careful with that. A couple things to note if you do that: they're driving on grass, not on hard cement, and they're doing it with a small seeded crop. Once you've threshed the seed, in other words, broken the seed off of the plant, now it's time to think about separating that seed from the non-seed material, also known as chaff. When we start talking about this cleaning process, there are two kind of forks in the road here, and it depends on if you're working with a dry seeded crop or a wet seeded crop. So dry seeded crops are ones where the seed and the fruit are dry once it reaches maturity. So lettuce, beans, brassica crops, many things are dry seeded. But wet seeded are ones where the fruit is still wet when you're harvesting it. So tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, these are all wet seeded crops. The technique of screening here is for dry seed crops. So I'm going to start with dry seeded crops. There are two main techniques for cleaning seeds of dry seed crops. The first is screening, which takes advantage of the fact that seeds tend to all be right about the same size. And so you can find a screen where the mesh size is either such that the seeds can fall through the mesh, but the non-seed, the chaff, stays on top of the mesh. Or you can find screens that are so small that the seeds stay on top of the screen and the dust and really fine chaff fall through it. And often you want to do both of those kind of screens to remove the bulk of the non-seed material from your seed. The other strategy is winnowing, and this takes advantage of the fact that seeds tend to be very dense and more dense than the stems, leaves, etc. that make up the chaff. Winnowing basically uses wind to separate seeds from the chaff. You can do this just naturally out here, or you can do it with box fans. There are machines that can help you do this, but basically what you're doing is you're pouring a thin stream of, this is seeds and chaff here coming out of this bucket, going by this set of box fans, and the seeds being denser will fall faster. So he's aiming to try and make the stream of seeds hit right about in between those two totes. The chaff, being lighter, gets blown more strongly by the wind and blown away from these totes. And so in this fashion, seeds fall down straighter, he collects those, and the chaff is being blown away. Notice that there's a second tote in this picture. That's to catch some of the smallest seeds, and also just in case there's any mistakes, this can catch those and you can always re-winnow. This process of screening and winnowing often is going to be done several times and maybe alternating between winnowing and screening in order to get things clean enough to store. Now talking about wet seeds, slightly different process. The kind of wet seed threshing is what we're seeing here. In some way, you've got to get those seeds separated from the plant. And this can happen with scoops. It can happen by pressing through some hardware cloth. Once you've got the seeds separated from the fruits, often for many wet seeded crops, you're actually going to go through this step of fermentation. In the case of tomatoes and cucumbers in particular, this fermentation step helps to dissolve. If you think about a fresh tomato or cucumber seed, they have these sort of slimy gel around it, and the fermentation will dissolve that slimy gel mucilaginous layer around the seeds. In the case of some of the other wet seeded crops like squash, the fermentation process basically just helps to dissolve some of that stringy placental tissue and makes it easier to clean. How this works is you're going to be putting the seeds plus the pulp into a container of some sort. Typically, you want to just have the seeds and the pulp with very little added water. You want this to be a pretty sugary mix, and then let it sit for 1 to 2 to 3 days, depending on your temperature, depending on what crop you're working with. and this will start to ferment, and that fermentation process will dissolve those gels around the seeds and will dissolve some of those strings and pulp, stirring it twice a day, keeping an eye out to see whether or not that gel is dissolved, or those sort of stringy placental tissue in the case of squash has started to soften up. You don't want to take this too far. It can damage your seeds if you over ferment. Once you've completed the fermentation process, what you'll do is you'll go through this process of rinsing and decanting, where you add clean water to top off your bucket and then pour it off slowly, and then just pouring off the pulp and the light seeds, and just until you're getting close to starting to pour off the good seeds, which have settled to the bottom. Then stop, add more water, stir it around, let it settle, and pour it off again slowly until you just are about to pour off the good seeds that had settled to the bottom. And keep repeating this process of filling it up and pouring it off until all you are left with is clean seed and water. At that point, you can, like this picture here on the right, pour off those seeds into a screen and then spread them out to dry quickly. Get them in a nice thin layer, apply lots of air, because once these seeds have been done fermenting, they're much more prone to be able to sprout if they stay moist. So get them dry. So now you've got your seeds clean and dry. How are you going to be able to store them so that you can plant those seeds the next year or 2 years or 3 years or so on? A few key tips for seed storage. First, you'd like it to be in a cool, dry, and dark place. You'd like, kind of as a general rule, if you took the temperature in Fahrenheit and you added it to your relative humidity, those two together should be less than 100 degrees. So something like 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity is a good seed storage temperature. You'd like the storage conditions to not fluctuate very much in terms of temperature or humidity. You'd like a nice, stable, constant place. You want to make sure that your seeds are really well labeled, because what you feel confident that you remember now, you might not remember next year, and that's really disappointing. And make sure that they're protected from pests, because rodents and insects will love to go after seed. So obviously, this was a lot of information thrown at you quickly, and yet it was also really general information that doesn't give you enough to save seeds of any specific crop. However, there are a lot of wonderful resources for you to access as you dive into this. First, I would make a pitch for seedalliance.org. Our webpage has many, many publications on general seed saving and crop-specific seed growing and seed production guides. Some of those resources are available in Spanish as well. We also have an organic seed internship for people that are working on farms this year and want a month by month, season-long course that will teach you about all the different aspects of growing seed commercially. For those of you in California, I want to share with you a couple of upcoming events that are happening that can help you get more involved with the seed growing community and learn some more about seed. The first is the California Organic Seed Summit. This will be a virtual event happening March 22nd through 26th throughout the week. You can check it out at our website and sign up for it and be able to participate. It's free. The second is the California Organic Seed Entrepreneurship Intensive. You have to apply, and this is going to be a small cohort of people who are going to be taking an in-depth course on how to start up your own seed business. So the applications are available until March 1st, so I'd encourage you to take a look at it if you're considering growing seed commercially or having a seed business. Quick final advice for folks that are just getting into seed saving. First, start small and start with a crop that you love so that you're more likely to be successful in your first try. Consider your climate, grow crops that are good for your climate, and don't try and fight your climate and grow things that aren't suitable for it. Make sure it works in your system. Make sure that you have the space and the time available to go through all those steps of seed growing when they need to happen. Make sure that you have infrastructure in place during that critical time period when you're bringing your seed out of the field, getting it cleaned and dry. Make sure that you're ready to take the time and have the space to do that. And then again, because there's so much to learn here, take the opportunity to meet other seed savers and share information at some of those resources that I pointed you to. And certainly you can sign up for Organic Seed Alliance's newsletter. Check us out on social media. Those are all great places to learn more and get more involved and plugged into the seed growing community. So with that, I'd like to turn around and see if anyone has questions and answer those questions for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jared. So yeah, if you guys have questions, if you look down on the bottom right corner of your screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. Go ahead and pop a question in there, and we'll spend the remainder of today's workshop seeing if Jared can answer them. So let's go ahead and start off. One of the first questions we had was, how do you achieve genetic diversity in self-pollinating plants?
That's a great question. And often self-pollinating plants don't necessarily have a lot of genetic diversity. Certainly, when we talk about modern varieties of self-pollinating plants, they often have a very narrow amount of genetics. And that's actually part of the history of self-pollinated plants, is that cross-pollinated plants tend to be the ancestral types that are much more adaptable and flexible to changing environmental niches. But then self-pollinated crops can kind of focus in and preserve this specific set of genetics that is very well adapted to a specific niche. But then if those, as those, niches change, sometimes those varieties disappear. Now, when we look at more kind of land race type self-pollinated crops, what you really are seeing is sort of a mix of a whole bunch of self-pollinated varieties all just growing together. You look at kind of a land race bean and you see different seed coat types. Really, they're not necessarily crossing with each other. It's as if you took a bunch of varieties, mixed them together, and they're just growing out year to year. But what's great about that is you still, if there are certain years where one of those types performs a little better because it's maybe more drought tolerant, it will be there in your mix. Or another year where it's really wet, another one can tolerate that, it'll be there in your mix. So that's often what you see in terms of preserving genetic diversity in self-pollinated crops, is it's really sort of almost like a mix of varieties.
Great. So another question someone has is about storage. So is it better to store seed in an airtight container or ones that can breathe?
Great question. I would say that the ideal situation is this. You want your seed to be very dry and you want it to go in an airtight container. If you have questions about whether your seed is very dry, then the breathable containers might be more appropriate, because what you want to avoid is wet seed in an airtight container. Condensation forms on it, and condensation is the bane of seed. That will cause mold. But one strategy to know if your seed is dry enough, one, you can buy a hygrometer to measure the humidity in your containers. But if you take like just a coin envelope or a regular envelope, anything that actually you have to lick it to seal it, and you put that down through the middle of your seeds in your container, you can take that out and check it occasionally. And it's if it's sort of lost its crispy, paper feel, it's a little bit softer of paper, that's a concern. And if the lick to seal, seal is actually stuck to itself, that's a sign that you've got too much moisture in that container. You need to take that seed out and spread it out and dry it.
And how long will those seeds last after preserving them? Does it depend on the type of seed?
It varies a lot. Yes, so there's some seeds like parsnips that are notoriously short-lived. You may only have a season or two, even in the best condition with them. Where some other there are stories of squash, well-preserved squash seeds being dug out of archaeological digs, 500-year-old seeds that have still been able to germinate. So it's a wide range, and it varies quite a bit based on the crop type. But the way that if you can get them dry and keep them cool and dry, that will have a huge influence in being kind of on the long end of any of those ranges that you see for each individual species.
Another attendee asks, can seeds be saved from hybrid varieties?
So generally, yes. Most hybrids you can save the seed from and they'll produce more plants. There are some exceptions in the case of some of brassicas, for example, actually use these sort of sterility mechanisms to make the hybrid that will make it hard for it to make seed. But most hybrids will make seed and produce plants. But those plants will not be true to type, meaning they won't necessarily look like the hybrid that you grew before. Instead, a hybrid is basically the result of a cross. And what you start to see the next generation is this whole big segregation where some of the plants look like one of the parents of the cross, some might look like the other one of the parent, and some might look like any number of combinations of that. So if you're interested in doing plant breeding, a hybrid is actually a pretty good way to get started because someone already made a cross for you. But if you're looking to just save seed and have it be true to type, unfortunately, saving seed from hybrids will not guarantee that.
Another person asks, are there any books you would recommend for a thorough overview of seed saving from different crops, including selection?
Yes, a couple of good books that I would recommend are, maybe in my biased opinion, um, there's the Seed Garden that myself and Michaela at Organic Seed Alliance wrote with Seed Savers Exchange that goes through a lot of different crops. The other one is Suzanne Ashworth's Seed to Seed is kind of the classic that has slightly shorter descriptions on saving seed, but I think covers maybe twice as many crops as Michaela and I covered in the Seed Garden. And then the third is called The Organic Seed Grower, and John Navazio wrote that, and that has actually maybe the fewest number of crops, but he goes into really good detail on the crops that he covers, which are some of the most important seed crops. He really talks about it from a commercial seed production standpoint, from the selection standpoint, and gives a lot of great detail about each of the crops he covers. So between those three books, depending on Suzanne's Seed to Seed covers the most crops, but maybe with the least depth. Michaela and I's book, The Seed Garden, covers the medium amount of crops with medium amount of depth, and John Navazio's Seed Producer covers the fewest crops with the most amount of depth.
Here's a really good question for the entrepreneurs here. What seeds are in greatest demand? If you were starting a seed business, what would you grow?
That's a good question, and I would say I would, first I would think about where I am and what my climate can support, because seed yields vary massively depending on whether you're targeting your climate appropriately or not. You'll see, in California, tomato seed production, squash seed production, some of the warmer seeds, whereas, up in Washington, you might see more spinach and brassica seed, seed production that is cooler. Organic Seed Alliance has a kind of a guide to climate, to figuring out what crops to grow for your climate. The other thing I would consider in terms of demand is some seed crops lend themselves to mechanization more than others, and the ones that are really easily mechanized tend to be in lower demand and lower value because you can grow them, over 100 acres and combine them, and so that tends to be the scale that they're grown at. Other things like tomatoes, for example, that require often staking and hand harvesting, they are, that doesn't lend itself to mechanization as much. And so as, on a smaller scale, you can get a higher price. The final thing I would say is that cross-pollinated crops tend to be in higher demand in general because an individual seed grower might only be able to grow one of those crops on their farm. And so the seed companies are always looking, they're always looking to find new growers for brassicas, for, quinopods, the beets and chard, for spinach, for the cross-pollinated crops, because each of their growers is only be able to grow one or a few of those compared to something like, beans, peas, or even tomatoes, where they could be growing dozens of them because of the small isolation distance requirements.
And so speaking of cross-pollination, what range of distances are necessary to ensure no crosses between varieties?
That's a good question, and what I would say, I would really highly pitch our introduction to seed saving guide that we have on seedalliance.org on our website. It has a great table that goes through crop by crop and talks about what isolation distance and what population sizes are recommended, but it can vary quite a bit. So for self-pollinated crops like tomatoes, beans, lettuce, well, tomatoes that are self-pollinating tomatoes, not the heirloom tomatoes that have that exerted stigma, but the self-pollinating tomatoes, we could be talking about, 10 feet or something like that, really just enough to prevent them from accidentally physically touching each other or mixing. On the far end of things, wind pollinated crops like beets and corn we're talking somewhere between a half mile and up to 3 miles of distance between them and another variety of that same species in order to prevent accidental crossing. I will say one more quick thing about that. It also depends on what your risk tolerance is. So if it's something where, and happens in the real seed industry, where if someone's growing a red beet and someone else is growing a red beet, they're allowed to grow them closer to each other than if someone's growing a red beet and someone's growing Swiss chard, which is the same species, Beta vulgaris, but look very different. Because if 1 in 1,000 seeds is crossed between a red beet and a red beet, no one's going to notice. But if 1 in 1,000, if you're in a beet field and you see that Swiss chard popping up every 1,000 plants, it's going to be super obvious that something's wrong with your seed. And so, it depends on what the risk is. Same thing if you're talking about if you're trying to save seed of an heirloom corn in the middle of GMO corn country, and you really don't want those GMO any of that GMO contamination to come in, you're going to want to make sure your isolation distance is really great.
And so with the last couple of minutes, I'd like to bring this question in, which I really like, is how did you learn to save seeds? How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I got into this. After I started working on farms when I was in college, and after college, I looked for an internship and happened to find this incredible farm in New Mexico that focused on seed crops. That was how we made our livelihood, and we grew at a small scale, about 60 different seed crops every year, and it was so much fun and so empowering to be going through the field and deciding like, okay, these are the plants we're going to be saving seed from, knowing that we were stewarding these varieties. And then, when we're selling the seed, we'd often just be selling to other farmers in the area and to like have this, 4-ounce baggie of tomato seed that I knew we had done such a good job of. And another farmer was taking that and was going to be planting a big field. It just felt like it was just so cool to feel like did a good job and we're going to have a real positive impact on other farmers, through our, job of growing seed. So that's kind of where I got started, is working on that farm for a few years.
Well, that's really great, and I wish the best of luck to everyone who's here on the on the webinar in your own seed saving pursuits. I'll let you know that today's event is being recorded. We're going to be posting that on CAF's website, as well as our YouTube channel. So if you're on the mailing list, expect a link to that, as well as a number of other recordings. We still have a few more days left of the conference with lots more workshops. Jared, final words.
Yeah, final word is, if I wasn't able to get to your question today or more questions pop up, please, please, please feel free to email me at Jared, Jared, at seedalliance.org. It's my job to answer your questions and help you in your seed growing endeavors. So please feel free to reach out.
And Organic Seed Alliance has so many different resources. So I really encourage you all to visit the website, follow up with Jared. They also do other workshops and trainings throughout the year. So really encourage you to, if you're serious about seed saving, definitely stay tuned to what's happening over at the Organic Seed Alliance. Jared, thank you so much for being here. When you finish up this webinar, everyone's going to see an evaluation pop up on your screen. I encourage you to take just 1 minute, fill that out, super quick, super simple, helps us get feedback for next year's conference. But without further ado, thank you so much for being here. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much, Jared.
All right. Thanks, Evan. Take care, all.